So we just bought this guy. It's a vacuum chamber. We've never used one before. The thing I really have been liking to do lately is to make some dice. The first step is, of course, to make molds. I've used the Umu 30 before for dice, worked really well. Instead of using the vacuum chamber, because we didn't have one, we actually used a pressure pot to kind of squeeze down the bubbles in comparison to a vacuum chamber, which is actually just going to pull all the air out. We were able to get very good results with the pressure pot for the mold making. Kind of interested to see what the difference between the vacuum chamber and the pressure pot are going to do specifically for mold making. We got this size so that we can do kind of big amounts. This will be really a kind of a good test on a small scale to be able to see how this works. So right after I hot glued the dice into the Dixie cup, I poured water into all of them and then poured that back into a measuring cup so that we could figure out how much volume each one of those was going to take so we'd know the entire project volume. We got up to about 510 milliliters. Our main mixing cup only goes to 500. We'd be above that, and that would be an issue using the vacuum chamber. When all the bubbles are going to escape, it's going to escape high, so it would just make an extreme mess inside of there. So we're going to do it in 2 pours. So we have 4 cups at 130 milliliters, so we have a little bit of extra there just in case. Both parts measured out 1 to 1. I'm going to put them in our mixing cup and then do some mixing and then do some vacuum chambering.
Nice.
Let a little air in there, and then we're going to pull some more. Alright, the last one came out really messy because I was trying to let as much of this come out of there as possible. I'm seeing a couple bubbles just kind of at the surface, and I don't know, we'll find out. Not being able to leave well enough alone, I am going to actually do another pull on the molds because more bubble removal. It just seems like a thing to do. Okay, so it's the next day, and these have all completely set. We really only needed to wait about 6 hours, but we did it late, so just let them go overnight. Pulling them out is really easy. I actually just kind of rip the Dixie cup away, and that's looking really good. Very uniform. A good sheen on there, so it looks like this worked out. Use a simple blade. Fold it apart as I'm cutting, so you cut the same line. Now I'm actually just going to pull the D6 out so that I can see what I'm working with here. And we still have some connecting. Alright, so that was the D6. It looks really good. Whenever we would pour this without doing a vacuum or a pressure pot, you could see the bubbles, even in just the mold, and this looks very clear. So we got all of the molds pulled out of the Dixie cups, and then I went ahead and grabbed some other ones and actually cut off the top and bottom. It fits perfectly to create a tight seal within the mold. You just kind of push tightly on the top like that, and it makes a really tight seal just with the silicone mold itself. So we're going to be using the alumalite Clear Slow. It's 1-to-1 by weight, and we're shooting for about 40 grams total for it to fill all of these. It's a bigger die set than we've used before, scaled up a little bit. They're kind of interesting. Here's a standard die compared to the bigger one. And when we cast this, the entire project took about 24 to 28 grams, so we are upping it quite a bit. You don't want to run out. Probably a bigger cup than we need to be using. Alright, so everything is poured in, ready to go. I'm just going to be sticking in the pressure pot, and we'll find out how they turn out in tomorrow. So we go to just about 40 psi. It seems to work really well. I don't know that anything else higher than that is necessary. But we were saying 40 grams initially, and that's what we actually used. But that came up short. We needed about 10 grams more, so for all those dice, we ended up using 50 grams total of the alumalite clear slow. If that type of thing happens for a smaller project like this, it's not too hard to whip up a second batch. You just gotta try to get your proportions on the pigment powders about where they were at. It's gonna be pretty close, and you might be able to tell that that's a different dye, but that just gives it a bit more character. So I pulled the molds out of the pressure pot. I already pulled 2 and they look pretty good. I'm pretty careful about not letting the D6 sprue break off the actual die. If that does happen, it can break too far down, and then you'll actually remove a chunk of the die, which then you have to even out by sanding off the opposite corner, or it kind of wrecks it. I try to be really careful about not snapping that section. So the next step is to remove the sprues. The way I like to do that is using this hobby saw.
Say something about being safe with your fingers.
Oh. This saw has tiny, tiny nubs, so I can saw myself.
Oh, God.
It doesn't...
Oh, I stop it. I was just saying, like, to tell people not to touch it with their fingers.
Nope, it doesn't matter. I mean, I didn't push hard, but it's really little.
Oh, to stop that.
So, don't worry about it. It's all good. That's why this is so accurate, because it does not take a lot off at once. Especially skin.
Jesus.
A little messied up, but that's all sandable, and that'll polish really nicely. I got all the dice sawed off from their sprues. They all came up pretty nicely. Next step, wet down this 1000 grit sandpaper. That'll really help me wear down, so we've got this line here, which I'll be able to get rid of most of that. Any of this kind of nastiness on where the sprue was cut off from, that'll really be cleaned up with the 1000 grit. The 1500 grit is just on there to get a sheen up a little bit more. Not so much for removal, but it does help get us to the point where we can then use the fine scratch remover plastic polish. It gets everything pretty much up to sheen without being sanded. And then a little bit of plastic polish number 1, this shine, really helps kind of finish them off a little bit. And then we'll get into inking the numbers, which is actually painted on, but that's a whole process. Another one from Ribonator. I do pretty much the same thing he does. I've tried it a couple different ways, but just keep coming back to that because it always works. So the way I found to ink these best is use a kind of semi-flexible brush with a little, it's got a little bit of spring to it. When I apply the paint, I'll actually paint in the line. So I'm trying to use as least amount of paint that I need, because the way to clear it off is with your thumb. I've used paper towel, I've used other things, but the thumb is the kind of cleanest way to get those numbers cleared. So I kind of smeared it on there a little bit too much. This brush might actually be too big. But that's the cool part. So really, using less paint is just better for your fingers. The dye doesn't really care, but if you keep having too much paint, and your hands get full of it, obviously it's going to transfer over to the dye and make a mess. So I'm going to try to do this a little bit cleaner. But you just really want to make sure it's in the number there, and then it comes out really clear. I've gotten half this one done to let it dry so that I can hang on to it to paint the other ones. I'll set it aside so then I'll just move on to another dice, and I kind of rotate through the entire dice set so they're drying as I'm doing another die, and that way it just kind of cuts down on the mess. There's not as much cleanup afterwards. So we put a couple sets of dice through those molds we created with the vacuum chamber, and they came out really nice. Looking specifically at the dice that came out of the molds from the vacuum chamber versus molds that came out of the pressure pot are really similar, to the point where I don't think anyone could tell using it or seeing the end product from either. So the vacuum chamber is a very good addition to our shop, but not necessarily for dice, because we could probably do everything we needed to with just the pressure pot, so it'll be useful for a lot of bigger things coming up soon.